Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of The Angry Doctor. I'm Joel Keenan, an internist in Southern Maine, and I want to talk to you today about the revised 2025 U.S. dietary guidelines published last month by Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Every 5 years for the last several decades, the U.S. government has been giving us advice about what you and I ought to eat as part of a healthy diet. In 2020, those guidelines were a 164-page document, but they were summarized really nicely just by a graphic, something that they call My Plate, that just shows you a picture of what a healthy meal would look like. And you can see right away, it's half the plate is fruit and vegetables, another quarter whole grains, and another quarter lean protein with some dairy on the side. And that basically is what that 164-page document recommended. And that's really been what the U.S. has recommended for several decades. There have been various iterations of that, and there have been shifts towards low saturated fat and more whole grains and then less whole grains. But basically, for many, many decades, since the 1940s, that's what the government has been suggesting that we eat. A lot of fruit and vegetables with lean protein and whole grains and dairy. That is not what we have been doing. Most Americans have ultra-processed food as more than half their diet. Most Americans have about 10 to 12% of their caloric intake as fruit and vegetables. A really puny portion of their dietary intake is fruit and vegetables. The government specifically recommended we increase that level of intake in the 1970s, and 40 years later, our intake was the same, about 10 to 12% of our overall caloric intake. So we've never really followed these guidelines, and the guidelines have been fairly consistent. But the new ones that Secretary Kennedy just released represent a radical departure in one important respect that I'll get to in a couple of minutes. But let me just take you briefly through the gist of his guidelines otherwise. And you can see he offers this inverted pyramid, which is a play on earlier iterations of the guidelines that offered a pyramid for what we ought to eat. And you can see, just glancing at it, this is going to be a diet really rich in animal food and in fruit and vegetables. That's going to be the overwhelming majority of it, with just a relative paucity of whole grains down at the bottom. Okay, so let's look at some of the specific advice he gives. Eat the right amount of food, he said. Don't eat too much food. Well, it's good advice. Dieting is a terrible way to lose weight, as you probably know. What's really important is that you eat the right kind of food, and we're going to talk about what that is in a couple of minutes. But anyway, he goes on to say eat fruit and vegetables throughout the day. That's good advice. He says 3 servings of vegetables and 2 of fruit. I don't know what that means. I don't know what a serving is. Is it a cup or a half a cup, 6 ounces or 8 ounces? Anyway, I'm glad he says eat that food throughout the day. That's good to see. Focus on whole grains. That's good advice. Prior guidelines had said make at least half your grain intake whole grains, which is really terrible advice. Just that was a sop to the cereal industry, so that people could keep eating Captain Crunch and not feel guilty about it. And Kennedy says really focus on whole grains. That's good advice. Limit alcoholic beverages. Prior guidelines had said for men no more than 2 drinks, for women no more than 1. This just says limit them. That's a sop to the alcohol industry, I think, because if you're drinking 6 shots of vodka a night and you cut down to 5, you've met the guidelines. Well, big deal. Limit highly processed foods, and sure, none of the prior guidelines have ever suggested that we eat a lot of processed food, so that's consistent with prior guidelines. And incorporate healthy fats and consume dairy. Omega-3 are healthy fats. Most Americans are deficient in that. That's good advice. Regarding dairy, this is a departure from prior guidelines. He's encouraging full-fat dairy, and there's some controversy about that. I think saturated fat is bad for us in excess, and I wrote a paper about that. I'll show you a link to that at the end of this talk. I don't want to dwell on that. The only other thing I'd say about that is he suggests limiting saturated fat intake to no more than 10% of your diet, which is consistent with prior guidelines and is impossible to do if you follow the rest of the Secretary's guidelines, as I'll show you now. Because the main thing that he's suggesting, and the big departure from prior guidelines, is prioritize protein at every meal. And he gets specific about this. For decades, since 1940, U.S. dietary guidelines have said 0.8 grams per kilogram per day suffices for healthy adults, and it does, by the way. We've known that since 1907, when Russell Chittenden ran some studies proving that. But Secretary Kennedy says, no, we've got to increase that target to 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram per day, as much as doubling the targeted intake for protein for adult Americans. Wow, that's a big change. And first, let's look at what that looks like, because who knows what 0.8 or 1.6 grams per kilogram per day looks like. Here's what it looks like. If you're a 185-pound adult, you'd need to take in 134 grams of protein to meet Kennedy's guidelines of 1.6 grams per kilogram per day. Here's a graphic showing something very close to that, 137 grams of protein a day. Look at what you got to do every day. Yogurt and bacon for breakfast, walnut salad, chicken for lunch, more chicken for dinner, some green beans for dinner, but that's not enough to meet your protein target. You're going to have a boiled egg and beef jerky every day. And that gets you to 137 grams of protein. Look what else it does. Your fat content skyrockets, 45% fat, and your fiber content plummets, 19 grams of fiber. Who cares? Well, U.S. guidelines have suggested for many decades Americans need at least 38 grams of fiber a day. And when we're talking about fiber, we're talking about plants. As you know, there's no fiber in animals. You get that from plants. What did hunter-gatherers, our ancestors, for 300,000 years eat? Up to 100 grams of fiber a day. 10 times the fruit and vegetable intake you and I take in. Now, they had higher caloric demands, but still, they ate a lot more plants than we did, which makes sense. Animals ran away, so they're going to be harder to catch. So sure, humans would thrive on plants, and they did. Not if you eat this. What you're going to get if you eat this is constipation, and a lot of other things too that I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. But that's one of the dramatic consequences of substantially increasing your protein intake. Your plant intake will necessarily plummet. Okay, so that's what he's recommending. Big change. Well, let's look at the evidence for that. You know, if you're gonna recommend a dramatic increase in protein intake as he did, there's going to be some powerful evidence to support that. He's not just making it up. Let's take a look at the evidence Secretary Kennedy published. And there it is. There is no evidence. The 2020 guidelines were 164 pages. Kennedy's guidelines are 10, including pictures. There's no evidence offered. Well, so what? I mean, look, we've all got to eat protein. We know protein's good for us. Just to hell with it. Just eat protein. What could go wrong, right? All kinds of things can go wrong, will go wrong, are going wrong, will continue to go wrong, and will get worse. First, on an individual level, first of all, you know, every gram of protein you and I eat that we don't need doesn't get stored as protein. Humans cannot store excess protein. It gets stored as fat. So eat more protein than you need and you'll get fat. That's what happens. And look around you. That's what is happening. 3/4 of Americans are overweight, And that's why our diet is already predominantly protein. Secretary Kennedy's advising we increase that. What the hell? It's terrible advice. The other big consequence, just on an individual level, and there is a mountain of evidence supporting this statement, is a diet rich in fruit and vegetables, nuts, seeds, and legumes is incredibly healthy and dramatically reduces our risk for our leading causes of death, heart disease and cancer, and far more than that, overweight and obesity, insulin resistance, diabetes, hypertension, arthritis, many, many things. There is a mountain of evidence supporting that statement. And, the fact that Secretary Kennedy showed us a graphic showing half animal protein and half fruit and vegetables, that's nonsense. Because if you meet his protein target, you're not going to have room for those fruit and vegetables. As my example showed you, there's no way that's going to happen. What you're going to have is a calorie-dense diet that's going to be deficient in fruit and vegetables, nuts, seeds, and legumes. That's the problem on an individual level. But there is a broader problem on an ecologic level. A third of the world's land is devoted to agriculture. It's a big project, producing the food that 9 billion humans need. And 2/3 of that land is devoted to raising animals to be our food. And you might think, well, you got to use the land you got to use to raise the food you got to grow to feed the people who need the food. What else are you going to do? Raising animal food or plant food, there's no difference. Either way, you've got to grow the food. And actually, there's a huge difference. There's a 27 times difference. And what I mean by that is, if you grow a gram of cow protein and you grow a gram of lentil protein, same amount of protein, you spent 27 times more greenhouse gas emissions to grow that cow protein than you did to grow that lentil protein. A staggering difference. And who cares? Hey, if you don't care about global warming, never mind that. Just look at the cost in land and water to grow that animal protein. Look at what's happening to the land we have available and the water we have available. You need land to grow food, and you need water to drink water. Look at it. A third of the world's forests are gone, and half of those were depleted in the last 100 years, largely to grow animals to be our food. 3/4 of the lost Amazon rainforest, 3/4 of the Amazon rainforests that have been converted to any other usage have been converted to animal protein purposes, pasture land for cows or cropland to feed animals that we're raising to be our food. We're running out of land. 1/3 of all the arable land in the world is gone, and it's gone in the last 40 years. We are running out of land to grow our food. And that's not all. Half the rivers and streams in the United States no longer adequately support marine life because we're dumping animal waste into those rivers and streams and nitrogenous waste from the fertilizers used to feed the animals that we raise to be our food. That waste is causing algae blooms that, through a process called eutrophication, kill the marine life in those rivers and streams and create these huge dead zones. Where's the largest dead zone, a body of water that supports no marine life in the world? It's in our own Gulf of Mexico, drained down from the Mississippi River. This is not sustainable. 1/3 of our coral reefs are dead. And coral reefs support 1/4 of all marine life. Without marine life, we don't get oxygen from the ocean. Every other breath of oxygen we take comes from the ocean. No marine life, no humans. 90% of all fish, all large fish, are gone. We've hunted them down. We're running out of water. We're running out of animals to feed us. We're running out of land. This absolutely can't continue. And we've known this for decades. In 2015, when they were doing the dietary guidelines then, scientists proposed including a commentary on sustainability, on focusing on food that you and I can grow that won't kill off our arable land and pollute our bodies of water. And that proposal was shot down by the agribusiness industry. It never made it into the guidelines. It should have. What I'm telling you is not a secret. We've known for decades that this is true. We've been on this catastrophic path for decades, and it's going to get worse in the decades ahead. And all Secretary Kennedy has done is propose accelerating our own demise. That's what is going to happen if we do what's advised here. It's just disgraceful. I want to close by looking at just his introduction so you can get a real sense of what he's trying to pull off here. And I'll just look at three sections from it. The message is real simple. He writes, eat real food. You know, like any good lie that has the kernel of truth. He is talking about eating real food, but the message isn't simple at all. He's talking about increasing the proportion of our diet that is the most ecologically wasteful, the most injurious to our individual health and to our environmental health. It's the dumbest goddamn idea he could have possibly proposed. And he has not one bit of evidence to support it. And there's a mountain of evidence to the contrary. He says down below, for decades, federal incentives have promoted low-quality, highly processed foods and pharmaceutical intervention instead of prevention. That's true. Of all the agricultural subsidies in the United States that the federal government provides, 61% go to corn and soy subsidies. $5 billion a year or more of your tax dollars are going to subsidize the growth of corn and soy crops. Why? Because those are the two crops most used to feed the animals that will become our food in these concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs as they're called. The four biggest beef producers in the United States, Cargill, JBS, Tyson Foods, National Beef, they love those subsidies. They want those subsidies. They're in favor of Secretary Kennedy's advice here. More animal protein? You bet. Who was the single biggest contributor to President Trump's inauguration? JBS Foods, $5 million. That was money well spent. These recommendations were bought and paid for by the meat and dairy industry. He goes on. This crisis is the result of poor policy choices. Yeah. Inadequate nutrition research. Bullshit. There's plenty of great nutrition research. He just ignored it. And a lack of coordination across federal, state, local, and private partners. That's just BS. There's nothing to say about that. This changes today, he says in bold, as if he's the sheriff walking into town to rectify the situation. We're going to start eating real food. Oh, please. The government has never advised that we eat processed food, highly processed food, ultra-processed food. They've always been advising that we eat fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, legumes. They've always advised we eat a healthy diet. We just haven't been doing it. And what Kennedy now is doing is really just so much worse, advising we increase our animal protein intake. What a disaster that would be. Under President Trump's leadership, he concludes, really? We are restoring common sense? No, we're not. If we had common sense, we'd just notice what's going on in the world around us. We're ruining our rivers and streams, our oceans. We're losing our arable land. We're depleting our forests. We're sacrificing our rainforest to make a goddamn hamburger, Really? That's common sense? Scientific integrity. If he had any scientific integrity, he would read and respect these studies that we've been talking about. He wouldn't ignore them. And accountability to federal food and health policy. He's accountable to the industries that are subsidizing these guidelines. He's not accountable to us. He's ignoring our welfare. He's sacrificing our welfare. It's a disgrace. So don't fall for this bullshit. Make 2/3 of lunch and dinner vegetables. Eat plants. Make that most of your diet. It's good for you. We are $36 trillion in debt. The biggest part of our budget, the federal budget, is healthcare, directly or indirectly. We're all getting sick and dying because of the shit that we're eating every day. That is so easily solved. It's crazy that we're not doing it. You know, my dad served overseas in World War II, and so did yours, or your uncle, or your grandfather, or your cousin. And you know what those men did. It was breathtaking. That was the biggest disaster in the history of human beings. 60 million people killed in 6 years. And they came back from that event and got on about their business. And they did it for us, their children, so that we could live in a free country and hopefully make something of our lives. They met their responsibility to us. And we now have a responsibility to our children. We are leaving them a country in catastrophic debt with an ecologic plan that is an unfolding disaster. And we can do so much better. And we don't have to go to Europe and the Pacific to fight a war to solve this problem. We've got to take care of ourselves and eat healthy food and not fall for this bullshit that Secretary Kennedy is asking us to do. And we've got to reach out to our elected officials and say, stop these corn and soy subsidies. Stop letting the meat and dairy industry regulate what our government tells us to do in terms of what's a healthy diet. Start insisting that we observe common sense and respect established science and do what's good for us. And all kinds of good things come from that. We're more than up to the task. So let's get going. Thank you for watching. I put up on the slide here QR codes for you to, if you're interested, you can watch my talk about how we know how much protein we need, and a narrative review I wrote about that issue, and a paper I wrote about saturated fat. If you don't know how to use those QR codes, do what I did. Ask somebody under the age of 30 and they'll explain it to you. I hope that's helpful. I'll see you again soon. Take care.